Guys, I'm really happy to welcome to the podcast Colonel Grant Newsham. He's the author of a new book we're going to talk about. Couldn't be more timely. It's called When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Now, Colonel Newsham is a retired U.S. Marine, served in the Indo-Pacific region for decades. He's a former U.S. Foreign Service officer who covered both East and South Asia. He's an attorney who's lived in Tokyo for more than 20 years. This is the guy who knows Asia and who knows China. The book, again, is called When China Attacks. Colonel Newsham, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me. You make the argument in this book that China's goal is not simply to help usher in a multipolar world in which there are numerous independent foci of power. China wants to replace and displace the United States and eventually become the world's sole superpower. Now, are you saying that the Chinese plan is to do this sort of step by step? In other words, Taiwan first, the larger Asiatic region next, and then make a play for more global domination? How is China planning in the long term? We know the Chinese think that way, to replace the United States?
Well, make no mistake, as you've laid it out, that is China's objective, is not just to replace us, but rather to dominate us, ideally to destroy us. But China has an opportunistic approach to these things. But at the same time, they look at the whole map, they look at the entire globe, and they have established themselves on every continent, starting with a commercial presence, economic presence, which leads to political influence. And ultimately, there's a military objective to all of this. So it's like somebody who is at the same time checking every door to see if it's locked or not. And where you find an opportunity, and you push. And I do see things coming together over Taiwan in the near term. And that would best be looked at as a first step, really, to a much larger, longer sequence of events that is ultimately intended to bring us down.
I do want to talk about Taiwan. Let's look at the broad range strategy first, because in the book you define the different elements to it. The first element I think people are more familiar with: intellectual property theft, cyber espionage, commercial and military surveillance, the latest news about the Chinese balloon collecting intelligence information. But you also list biological and chemical warfare and specifically mention COVID-19. You mention economic warfare aimed at putting us out of business, psychological warfare, and then proxy warfare. Say a little bit more about this broad strategy, which seems to encompass financial elements, mental or intellectual elements, and then, of course, military elements.
Sure. Is usually important to remember, of course, that while China does all of these things, or some of them, just about anywhere on Earth, the U.S. is the main target. We're the country that they see as being the one obstacle to Chinese domination, and they're probably right about that. Biological warfare, that's usually something we think of in a sort of an all-out war, and only then. But the Wuhan virus, the COVID virus, it certainly came from China, and China certainly used it, at least opportunistically, almost as a test run, once they saw that it was out of the bag. And you look at what the effect it had. It stopped our economy, just caused immense political chaos, got Americans to give up rights that nobody ever thought they would do. And the effect of that has been the equivalent of winning a nice big battle. And that is effectively biological warfare. Now, the chemical warfare part of this is also referred to as drug warfare, and the Chinese refer to it that way. And that has been immensely successful. And by that, I'm talking about mostly these days the fentanyl scourge, which killed 70,000 Americans last year, 70,000. In the entire 12-year Vietnam War, 55,000 Americans were killed, and yet in 1 year, well, 70,000 Americans have died. Most of the fentanyl originates in China, and China could stop it if it wanted to, but it doesn't want to because it's been a very successful assault. But the Americans have not recognized it as an attack from China. There's the economic warfare that you mentioned as well. Think of it, since China got into the World Trade Organization, but even starting before that, look at the rush of American industry American business to China. And to build up, the idea was, well, if we build up China's economy, they'll eventually liberalize, become like a really big Canada. But also there was a huge sort of greed aspect to this, and the Chinese properly played on that. They got Wall Street, too much of America's CEO and business classes, to throw their weight around, use their influence, and get people to actually think, well, you have to be in the China market. If we do anything to challenge China, well, they won't do business with us. But you can get your enemy, your main enemy, and that is China's expression. When you get them to think that they absolutely have to do business with you, well, that has been a huge psychological warfare advantage, success, and a lot. You can see how these things tie together. The economic warfare destroys Americans' neighborhoods, makes them susceptible to chemical warfare. The dependency America has built up on China causes them to really tie their hands and refuse to really go after the Chinese Communist Party. And it was the Trump administration that was the first one to ever do this. Now, another thing that's worth pointing out, and where it doesn't get the attention it deserves, is the way that China is setting up really a military infrastructure throughout the world to eventually allow the People's Liberation Army to operate around the globe, just like the Americans do, and with the idea of eventually surrounding the United States, as hard as that is to imagine. And that's where the so-called Belt and Road Initiative comes in, all this overseas Chinese economic investment in particularly ports, airfields, things that work very nicely for a military. And if you look at the scale of this, it is breathtaking. And the fact that this has been allowed to happen without anybody really doing much about it or even saying much about it, once again, you've got to hand it to China that is a very successful form of political warfare.
Let's take a pause. When we come back, I want to talk specifically about, well, Taiwan, but also about Ukraine. We'll be right back with Colonel Grant Newsham, the author of When China Attacks.